In these first two chapters, we're going to discuss an approach towards analysing your own games, which will help you learn the most from them. Your first port to call when preparing for a new tournament is to analyse your games from your previous tournament, no matter how long ago this may have been. I understand that over the pandemic, it's been very difficult to play over-the-board chess, and you may have been playing most of your games at shorter time controls online. These definitely have their place, and you can learn from them too, but I suggest before playing your next over-the-board tournament, you should analyse your games from your most recent previous over-the-board tournament. This will help you understand your thought processes over the board and your decision making and your behaviour in general and how you handle the clock and how you handle pressure during a real face-to-face game. The process I'm going to suggest to you has 6 steps in it. The first one actually occurs during the game itself, and if you haven't been doing this already, you can start doing it in your next game. But please start writing down the time that you spend on your moves and the time that your opponent spends on their moves. It's very important to do this, and we'll go into the details about it later, but suffice to say for now, it will show you how long you're spending on different moves and on different critical moments throughout the game. And if you move too quickly and miss a win, or you move too slowly and get into time trouble, this will highlight it very quickly. I know from experience, from having played over the past few months and not having played over the board for a long time, that I'm suddenly facing time trouble a lot more frequently, despite all the online blitz. So hopefully writing down the time you spend on your moves will be very beneficial for you. Step number 2 then occurs just after the game. You should always try to analyse the game with your opponent afterwards. If it's a bad loss for one player or the other, they mightn't be in the mood for analysing, but even if you lose badly, you should definitely speak to your opponent about it afterwards too. It's always useful to find someone else's perspective on the game. You could also write down ideas that your opponent had or ideas that crop up in the analysis session on your score sheet. If you find this useful, it'll help you remember them later on. Step number 3 then is, again, straight after the game, or as soon as possible after the game, input the moves into the computer, into your preferred chess program, and take note of any variations you saw, write down any thoughts that you may have had, and of course write in the times that you spent on the moves too, which you've taken down during the game. This is always quite useful for you, and you should do this without the help of an engine. Do not look at it with an engine yet, as tempting as it may be, especially if you feel like you missed a win. Please write down all of your own thoughts, input your own moves and variations into the computer before you decide to check the engine. And only after all of this, having inputted your opponent's ideas, your ideas from the post-mortem, your ideas from during the game, the time you spent on your moves, and writing down any thoughts or your feelings about the game and your own evaluations, only then should you check the computer. And then, checking it with an engine, don't take the engine for granted. Its initial suggestions may not be that good. Check it, let it think for a long time. Depth 30 is usually a good ballpark to aim for, and only then input moves that it has seen that you hadn't, or any ideas that you may have missed from during the game. Always compare its evaluations with your own and how you felt about the position. And try to remain objective. If the computer spots a brilliant, fantastic win, that's very, very complicated. Don't beat yourself up about it. Just think to yourself, is it possible for somebody to see this during a game? And then number 5 then is to take note of the critical moments during the game. And this is one of the key points that we'll be talking about in this chapter particularly. Critical moments we're going to define as moments where the choice, the strength between the first choice and the second best choice is a massive difference. So, for example, the ballpark figure we're going to take is a difference of 0.5 in a computer evaluation. This is a good general rule of thumb. We can talk about exceptions to this later, but generally, if your chosen move or the best move of the computer, or the best choice of the computer is 0.5 in difference between the second best move, then this is a critical moment. There may be a moment where all the different moves are more or less equivalent, but you pick a move that is 0.5 lower than one of the best choices, and this is also a critical moment. So if you make a move that is slightly worse or significantly worse than the best choice, this is a critical moment for you then. So it's very important to take note of these during the game and try to develop a feeling for them. And this, combined with writing down the time you spend on your moves, will show you how well you sense the critical moments during the game and how carefully you consider the moves. And finally, number 6 is to try to learn 3 things from every game. This is a good rule of thumb. The more you try to implement this and the more you struggle to try to find new things to learn from each game, the better it will be for you. You'll find real improvement, and you will notice definite patterns between your games and in your style of play. It could be as simple as, I need to look up this opening variation, or this endgame I didn't know how to play, or this position type I need to learn more about. Or it could be a type of mistake that you're making, you overlook a particular tactic or pattern, or you didn't spend long enough on a particular move. All of this will become clear if you try to learn 3 things from each game. So in order to give you a complete picture of how to analyze your games, over the next 2 chapters I've decided to pick a win, a draw and a loss that I played before I started playing tournament chess again this year after the pandemic break. We're going to start with one game which I played in the first round of the Irish Championship in 2020. This was kind of early days in the pandemic, maybe 3 months in. This is the first event that was played that was held over the board in Ireland for a long time. And I was playing a talented Irish junior named Gavin Malloch, and I was also playing white. So in this game I started with the move 1d4, which was already a surprise for my opponent, and in fact created a sort of mini critical moment for black. I usually play 1e4, but I had something specific in mind against my opponent's usual choice of the Dutch defense, which is f7 to f5. And here he has to decide whether he wants to play f5 anyway and test my preparation, or play something different and try to get us both on our own. In the game he decided to play knight f6. So this I felt was already a slight psychological victory in that my opponent's playing something he's unfamiliar with. However, since neither of us have played for 3 months, it's quite possible that he had just learned a brand new defense for the tournament, and it's important. The next few moves will show how who's actually won the opening battle. So I decided just to keep things simple and play knight f3 because I had absolutely no idea what my opponent would play. If I had played c4, then he could choose between many different options, and I decided that knight f3 would be a better, more simple option because I get to keep things more flexible. So he actually played e6, which is again indicating that he is showing a light squared strategy. He usually wants to take control over the e4 square in some way. He might play b6, bishop b7, he might play d5. They're the usual ways for black to follow up here, and it's in the same spirit as the Dutch defense, which with the pawn on f5 tends to cover the e4 square as well. So again, not being sure exactly what my opponent would do, I decided to play g3. And this was a simple approach that I'd sort of prepared for the tournament. In general, I just wanted to play d4, knight f3, g3, bishop g2 and castles if I didn't get specific preparation on the board. And here, because my opponent surprised me, I decided to keep things safe and just play g3. And now he commits to playing b6. So now it's very clear that he wants to cover the e4 square, which is a very important endeavor for black in these openings. He just wants to play bishop b7, cover e4, and try to prevent white from expanding in the center. Now, one of the main moves here would be c4, and this would transpose into a line of the g3 Queen's Indian. But here black has many options. Bishop a6, he even has bishop b4 check, sometimes c5, as well as, of course, bishop b7. So I decided I'll just play bishop g2 and make my opponent wait and decide where he's going to put his bishop. Now if he plays bishop a6, it doesn't make any sense because the long diagonal is open for white's bishop, and the bishop on a6 does not hit the c4 pawn. So he more or less has to play bishop b7, and once again I decided not to play c4 yet and just castle instead. Again, if I had played c4, black would still have the option of bishop b4 check, so I wanted to take this option away from him. And after castles, my opponent committed to bishop e7, and only now do I play c4, and I've avoided the bishop b4 check lines and all the bishop a6 lines. So 6 moves in, I'm actually feeling pretty good about this. I think this is the opening experiment has worked out. After castles and knight c3, we reach the mainline position of the old Queen's Indian, where black has put the bishop on b7. This is a traditional mainline. Black is still doing quite well here, but he needs to play some precise moves. So this is the first critical moment for black, the first real critical moment, where he has a fundamental choice to make of how to combat white's space advantage. White has 2 pawns on the 4th rank versus black's 2 pawns on the 3rd rank, and all the pieces are still on the board. So black is somewhat lacking in space. So your first task is to find the right move for black here. Have a think. And please feel free to pause your video and think for as long as you like. So the main move by far for black here is the move knight to e4. And this makes a whole lot of sense, and would be very much in the spirit of the Dutch defense, which my opponent usually plays. He's occupying the e4 square, preventing white from ever playing e4 himself, and trying to trade pieces, which will relieve black's space disadvantage. He quite often follows up with f5 and gets a reasonable position. This is where most of the mainline theory begins. Another approach is to play the move d7 to d5, which is another decent move, trying to equalize the space in the center. It's somewhat passive, and white has decent chances for a slight edge here, but it's not a bad move at all. And another interesting option for black is to play the move knight a6. This is aimed against white's idea of expanding in the center. So white can play e4, but if he decides to play something like d5 in order to block out the bishop and prepare e4, then black is just in time to stop it with knight c5. And again, this is an interesting way for black to play. Note also that the knight on c5 protects the bishop on b7, so if there's any opposition along this diagonal, it won't be unfavorable for black if he can defend his bishop. So oftentimes, a general rule of thumb is that if you have two fianchetto bishops opposing each other, the bishop that's undefended is the one that has to be very careful. And here white's bishop on g2 is defended, so it makes sense for black to try and defend his bishop too. So those would all be quite reasonable moves, but instead my opponent played the move d6. And unfortunately for him, this is not a great idea. He's just developing normally with the idea of playing knight bd7, but he doesn't take into account white's ideas in this position. So usually the best moves in chess are moves that take account of your opponent's ideas while furthering your own plans. So my opponent wants to just develop with knight bd7, but white has a way to punish this move order. So have a think about what white should play here. Thankfully, I actually knew the right move in this position in advance. I had studied this line briefly before, and I knew that the right way to punish black's idea is to play the move d4 to d5. But it is possible to find this move over the board using logic alone, so let's try to do that. Black clearly wants to play knight bd7, and in that case he can meet d4 to d5 with knight c5, as we saw from the knight a6 to c5 move order. However, black won't have time to do this, because after d5, white is threatening to play e4, and he gets a big space advantage in that case. So, knowing that knight e4 was the main move for black, and knowing that d5 was another good move for black, will help you find that playing d6 can be punished by playing the move d5, and white has a big space advantage and is trying to increase his space advantage by playing e4. So this is already clearly better for white, and this is where both players are on their own. This is the first time that white is completely out of book. So you can argue that over the next few moves a critical move will come up, a critical moment will arise, because usually the first critical moment arises when you are out of book. For black, on move 1, when he wasn't expecting d4, this sort of arose. I mean, obviously he knows what to play against d4, but he's wondering what I've prepared, and it's certainly a critical decision for him. And here, after black plays the move e5, which closes the center, if white's next move wasn't quite obvious, it would be time for white to stop and think, and it would be a critical moment for him. Here, thankfully, the move e4 is actually very obvious and is definitely the right way for white to play. By the way, black played e5 in order to avoid any potential tactical tricks along the long diagonal. We mentioned that his bishop was undefended, and that perhaps if white gets a chance, he might also play knight d4, and then he'll be threatening something like d takes e6, or he might start with d takes e6, and in any case, the e6 square and the bishop on b7 could be under fire, and they could be tactically vulnerable. So e5 prevents knight d4 and closes the center, and after e4 and knight bd7, now is the time for white to think. And in this position, I played the move knight to e1. In order to think about this situation, we have to decide what black is planning to do as usual. Black's plan is to play knight to c5 in order to attack the e4 pawn. And white would like, in these situations, to expand on the queen side. So this is sort of a King's Indian structure, where white's pawn chain points towards the queen side, and black's pawn chain points towards the king side. So black should be looking for play on the king side, white should be looking to play on the queen side, in general. White also has a lot of space in the center, so he may at some stage wish to play f4, which might be a good option as well. But it's not so easy for black to create counterplay here, because compared to the normal King's Indian, there are a few differences in white's favor. For starters, his bishop is on g2, and his pawn is on g3, and this makes it harder for black to create some pawn storm attack down the king side. Also, black's bishop is on b7 instead of c8. If it was on c8, it would be able to help prepare f5. Black's bishop on e7 may also be better on g7, as it sometimes is in the King's Indian as well. And with the pawn on g6, then this would also support f5. And finally, black has played the move b6, which has made it more difficult for white to break with c5, but eventually when white does get in c5, it will cause a lot more pawns for black. We'll be able to open a file or also fix a weakness on b6 by taking on b6, and black's pawns are fixed in a certain way then. So this is probably, altogether, this is a much better version of a normal King's Indian for white. So, borrowing ideas from the King's Indian, we want to be able to prepare c4 to c5, as we mentioned. This is white's main pawn break. And if white plays the move bishop e3, which would be a standard move to play in order to prepare c5, black can play knight g4 and disturb the bishop. Now, after bishop d2, we can kick the knight on g4 back, so this is not a disaster for white, but it makes a lot more sense to just prevent knight g4 altogether. With this in mind, the best move for white is to try and prepare bishop e3 and knight to d3. So after knight e1, the knight will come to d3 in order to support c5. It opens up the queen covering g4 and allows the bishop to settle on e3 without getting harassed by the knight on f6. So this is definitely the best way for white to play, and it's been played quite a bit in this position. Two other moves such as b4 are a little bit early because after a5, white is not ready to go a3 to help support the b4 pawn, and he'll lose control over the c4 square, or sorry, the c5 square as a result. So knight e1 was played, and black played rook e8. So black wants to reposition his bishop with bishop f8, g6, and bishop g7, but this takes a long time and sort of admits that black is in an inferior version of the King's Indian, because the bishop would normally be on g7 there already, and the rook tends to be better placed on f8 in order to help support f7 to f5. Usually it only goes to e8 when black wants white to fix the structure with d5, because here, after rook e8, if black was threatening e takes d4, then it would have some purpose. But here it's simply just used to help reposition the bishop, and this is quite passive for black. So after rook e8, instead of rook e8, another move could be knight e8, helping to prepare f5, and maybe regroup the knights, such as playing g6, knight g7, f5, bring the other knight to f6, and try to make sense of black's pieces. This is also worth considering. The best chance, however, may have been the move a5. And normally you shouldn't move pawns on the side of the board where your opponent is attacking, but here black is trying to stake out some space and control the c5 square, and he's already played b6, so this is somewhat consistent. He wants to just set up a wall of pawns to make it difficult for white to progress on the queen side. White can play knight d3, and if black plays the move knight c5 trying to blockade, then white has an interesting idea here with knight takes c5, and if b takes, he can play the move a4. This was suggested by the engine and was also played by Grandmaster Miroshnichenko back as early as 2005, I think. I've included the game there in the notes. The idea here is to fix the a5 pawn on a potentially weak square, and also just to shut down the queen side and switch the play to the king side, where white is going to use his central space advantage in order to prepare f4. So we can have a look at a sample line here. Bishop c8 was played in the Miroshnichenko game, but after knight d7, b3, knight b8, rook a2, this is a very nice maneuver. White is planning to play f4 and meet knight b4 just in time with the move rook af2. And you can see white is a very nice build up here and is clearly better. I've included some other games in the notes there that you can take a look at. For example, if black plays g6, still trying to play on the king side, then white can play rook a2, and if f5, this usually backfires for black because he hasn't got the support of his light square bishop on the queen side, and also his king is slightly more exposed with the bishop on e7 instead of g7. So after e takes f5, g takes f5, and bishop h3, white is starting to attack on the light squares and put pressure on the f5 pawn. After king h8, bishop h6, and for example queen h5, white is already winning here with perfect play because the f5 pawn is weak, bishop g5 is a threat. It's very difficult for black to cover the f5 pawn. So going back, instead of this, black played rook e8 in the game, and now white again has a choice to make of how to continue the game. How is he going to progress on the queen side? Should he play b4? Should he play bishop e3? Or should he play knight d3? Have a brief think and see if you can figure out what the best move is. Well, the moves bishop e3, the moves knight d3 and the move b4 are both somewhat premature. After knight d3, black can play knight c5 and trade pieces. Now, in fact, we have looked at something like this, and in fact, after takes and a3, funnily enough, black's best move may well be a5, and after a4 we have the same line we just looked at, but with the rook on e8 instead of f8, and it's not clear where it's better placed. So this is of course playable for white, but given the choice, I prefer not to exchange pieces because white has such a big space advantage. And as we mentioned before, b4 is still too early because of the move a5, where we will lose control over the c5 square. So bishop e3 is a very good idea, with the point that now we can play b4 because a5 can always be met by a3 and our rook is protected on a1. Black played bishop f8. Again, a5 may have been the best chance, and after a3 threatening b4, black can try h5. This was a computer suggestion. It's an unusual way to try and put pressure on white's position. Having put the rook on e8, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to push the h-pawn, but it's more of prophylaxis against white playing f4, and it does stake out some space on the king side. Here, an idea would be to play h4, and if knight g4, bishop d2, and here white is planning to gain further space and kick the knight back, and black's only real break here that makes any sense is g5, but it just doesn't work, actually. After g5, we can play f3, take the g5 pawn, and play f4. And due to the hanging pawn on h5, black is losing here after e takes and queen takes h5. So black's g5 break doesn't really work. He can try knight c5 instead, but after f3 he gets kicked back. And for example, this typical maneuver with b3, with the idea of playing rook a2 and rook af2, is very strong for white. And if black tries to go a4, then apart from winning a pawn by taking on c5, white can play b4 and simply ignore the knight. You can put the rook on f2 as normal and continue in the same vein that we mentioned, with eventually expanding with f4, maybe going king h2 and bishop h3 as well. So white's doing well here, and a5 is still the best idea. Instead, black continue with bishop f8, which is a consistent move, but after b4, white has a lot of space on the queen side. So black tried to exchange some pieces by playing a5, a3, trading rooks, trading pawns, and trading rooks. But now white occupies the a-file, and this is going to be a bit of a pain for black for the rest of the game. For example, if he tries queen a8, then very simply queen b2 is a good move for white, and he can follow up by moving this knight to d3 or c2 and regaining control over the a-file with rook a1. And despite the exchange of rooks, it's quite difficult for black to find space for his pieces. If he tries c5 is probably his best shot. If he tries to move queen a6, this rebounds on him after knight b5 because the queen is in danger of being trapped. Rook a1 will actually win the queen if it happens, and the c7 pawn is hanging. So black should try c5 instead, but after say knight c2, white is clearly better with rook a1 coming and plenty of play on the queen side. Instead, another option for black is to play queen e7, which hopes to occupy the a-file with rook a8, but after queen a7, white invades immediately and forces black to play rook b8 instead, probably to hold the position, and that's just very unpleasant for black. So instead, my opponent played knight g4. He's attacking my bishop on e3, and generally in these structures, this bishop is the most valuable piece for white. His dark square bishop complements perfectly his pawns on the light squares, and it's definitely stronger than a knight. So it's worth keeping the bishop at bishop d2, and now my opponent played g6. And here's a critical moment again. How should white play? Well, the first question to ask yourself is, what is black's plan here? And the point behind g6, from my point of view, was either to play f5, which looks a bit early. I'm not too worried about that with the rook on e8 and not on f8. But one idea that I am slightly concerned about is the move bishop h6. And this, as we mentioned, would trade off my very good dark square bishop for black's not so good bishop, the one that's hemmed in by the pawns in the center. So I'd rather avoid this, and white has several ways to do this. Now, you can learn a lot about your approach to chess depending on how you decided to deal with this idea. You can decide, well, I want to stop bishop h6 altogether. That's fine. I didn't see bishop h6, so I didn't consider my opponent's plans. Or I'm happy to allow bishop h6 because I don't think it's any good. And usually the latter two options are the ones that you should watch out for. So taking into account your opponent's ideas doesn't mean that you have to stop them all the time. And funnily enough, white has at least 5 very good moves here. Or 3 or 4 very good moves at least. So in the game, I chose queen c1, which prevents bishop h6 altogether. And now I have 2 pieces covering it, so black can't play it. This does take the queen off the a-file, however, so it's not absolutely ideal. One move that we could try is h3, but this doesn't really take into account black's idea, and he can play bishop h6. Now, still, this isn't disastrous. After bishop takes h6, knight takes, white can play knight f3, and after king g7 and queen a7, white still manages to invade, and he's still clearly better. But black has succeeded in exchanging off his bad dark square bishop, which I didn't like. the key moment comes if white plays f4, which looks like a very aggressive way to prevent black from playing to prevent black from swapping off bishops. But after knight gf6, black is suddenly at least equal here. He can put his knight on h5, and white's kingside is very loose, and his bishop on d2 is also unprotected. So this gives black plenty of counterplay. So if you played h3 because you missed bishop h6, you need to pay more attention to your opponent's ideas. Even if you still decide to play h3 and have seen the follow-up with queen a7, that's fine. But missing bishop h6 is the key idea for black, so we need to spot that. Another better way of playing is also bishop h3, and this is one of the top engine suggestions. The idea is that the bishop is more active on h3 than on g2, and also bishop h6 isn't so dangerous for white, because after takes and takes, we can invade with queen a7, and after, for example, bishop c8, knight b5, and rook e7, the key move is f3. And the reason why this is the case is because if white takes on c7, then suddenly he's a lot worse after queen takes, and knight f6. Both the bishop and the e4 pawn are hanging, and so is the knight on c7. So, for example, bishop takes c8, rook takes c7, forking the bishop and the c pawn. Bear in mind that the e4 pawn is still hanging. Bishop a6. The most precise way for black to play is rook a7, and this provokes white into playing b5, which would be a huge positional mistake, because after knight takes e4, the knight can jump back to c5 then, and it can never be kicked out of there. So white would have to go back to c8, and after knight takes e4, black is already much better. White has completely lost control of this position. So instead, the key prophylactic move here is f3. This covers the e4 pawn in advance and keeps the pressure on the c7 pawn. After f5, for example, trying to create some play, white can take on c7, and if black trades and plays knight f6, now white's in much better shape to deal with this. He can just play knight b5, and with the d6 pawn weak, black isn't going to survive this. After knight f7, white can simply trade on f5 and play knight c2, and his position is objectively winning. The f5 pawn is weak, the d6 pawn is weak, b6 as well, and white's pieces are all better than black's. They're all attacking, they're all very active. So this is also not so good for black. So bishop h3 is quite a nice idea, and it doesn't prevent bishop h6, but it just says that, well, I've taken account of your idea, but I don't think it's any good. Another good move was queen d1, which hits the knight on g4, but after bishop h6, this is still possible for black, and after takes, white's advantage is not as big as it could be with the queen on d1. So the strongest move according to the computer is actually knight c2. And this assumes again that black's idea is not very good, and if bishop h6 we can take queen a7, and we're ready to meet queen a8 with rook a1 and continue the attack down the a file. After queen c8, for example, bishop h3, black is under severe pressure here. So this is another good approach, and also works for white, but again, in these type of situations, it's very good to just keep a lid on your opponent's counterplay and prevent their ideas. So I played queen c1. Now, black just played bishop g7, which continues the regrouping, but black admits that he's not going to trade those darks for bishops anytime soon. Instead, f5 was another way for black to play, but he's not quite ready for this. After the move bishop h3, this is very awkward for black, as f3 is coming. The knight can't retreat to h6 because the queen and bishop cover it, and the f5 pawn is very weak. So instead, bishop g7 was played. After f3, the knight is kicked back. Another option for white is to play h3. This was also tempting, but I wanted to keep the h3 square available for the bishop on g2. So I've included some notes there, you can take a look at them yourself, but I think f3 is a slightly stronger way to play. After knight gf6, knight d3 was my choice. Knight c2 is another good move, with the idea of putting the knight on a3 and then potentially on b5. So that's also quite possible. For example, if black goes c6, we can trade and play knight a3, and the knight will sink itself on b5 soon. Instead, knight d3 also looked logical, and after queen e7, black is creating room for his rook to swing across the queen side. And I simply played bishop e3, again with the idea of supporting c4 to c5. Another option could be queen b2, but I didn't want to allow any counterplay associated with bishop h6 later on. So for example, after rook a8, rook a1, queen f8, now black is threatening potentially to take on a1 and play bishop h6, or play bishop h6 immediately. But after knight f2, this is a move that I didn't appreciate the strength of, but it comes up quite a lot. After knight f2, rook takes a1, queen takes, bishop h6. This now doesn't work for black because after takes, and queen a7, white can invade with impunity because queen e3 check is not a check anymore, thanks to the knight on f2, and queen c1 check can be met by knight c to d1, just defending everything. If you imagine the knight being on d3 in this position, I know there's a lot of arrows there, but if you imagine the knight being on d3 in this position, queen e3 check could definitely disturb white a lot. So playing knight f2 in advance is a very strong prophylactic move, just preventing any counterplay from black. So queen b2 is definitely another good option as well. After bishop e3, black played rook c8, and it's clear that he wants to play c6 here. So I didn't really feel comfortable with my queen along the c-file, so I will move that quite soon. But I saw a way to deal with c6. So how do we stop black from playing c6 without making any big positional mistakes? Well, the move b5 isn't any good because it gives away the c5 square. And the move c5 is what white is gearing up to play. But here black has a very nice response. He can play d takes, b takes, and bishop a6. And actually black is already better here. The knight on d3 is hanging, and the c5 pawn is in trouble as well. So c5 is still too early. Instead, I played the move knight b5, and well done if you spotted this. The idea is to meet c6, which was played in the game, with the move knight a7, forking the rook and the pawn on c6. So black did play c6 in the game, but he probably should have, and this is a critical moment for black, he probably should have played the move knight e8, just protecting c7. And after, say, rook f2, white is still clearly better with the idea of playing rook c2 and c5. Another option for black was bishop a6, and I was thinking about this during the game. After rook f2, bishop takes, c takes, I felt like this transformation of the structure would generally be pretty okay for black if he could play knight e8 and protect c7. But clearly the queen side is in white's command, is under white's control, and black would need the extra move rook f8 before playing knight e8 in order to create some play on the king side. As things stand, it looks like after knight e8 the rook is cut off from the king side, and black hasn't got time to create any counterplay. So this should still be very good for white. But c6 actually loses on the spot. So after knight a7, rook c7, black's position is desperate here. And I felt the clearest way to play was to play d takes c6. This is more flexible than taking with the knight, because then I'm committed to taking off everything on c6. Whereas I felt like taking on c6 first, he must go bishop takes, and now I can take on c6 again, or do something else. Another good option is queen a3, but it allows some counterplay, and I think from a human perspective, this is probably what put me off. C takes, and now knight takes d5 followed by e4 is a possible try for black in order to just mix the position up, but it shouldn't really work. It is a whole piece sacrifice, and the thing is, white needs to find a very precise move to win here, and obviously I didn't see this during the game. So the move he needs to find is knight c6, otherwise black gets lots of play. Bishop takes, d takes, e takes d3, and bishop f2. And white needs to see as far as here and realize that rook takes c6 runs into queen a8 check, picking up the rook, and that after knight e5, white can play b5 and has a winning position with the two bishops and the protected pass c pawn and the weak b6 pawn. Complicated. So there's no need to allow that, even though queen a3 may be objectively best. So I mentioned at the start of the clip about how sometimes the computer suggests lines that are winning for one side or the other, but that are difficult to play in practice. So you shouldn't beat yourself up for not finding the absolute best, strongest move in every position if it is practically difficult to play. Instead, here I played the move dc6, and after bishop takes, then I played queen a3, avoiding all of this nonsense with taking on d5. If I had played knight takes c6, this would also be good for white, but only if he follows up with b5 and knight b4, controlling the c6 and d5 squares. I felt it was better to keep the tension, so I just protected the knight on a7. Now, black's best move is probably bishop b7, but I feel like the simplest move for white here is the move knight b2, protecting c4, threatening knight b5, followed by queen a7. Bishop h3 is still an idea to pop the bishop out and attack. Rook a1 is also a good move. White is doing really well here. Again, I was thinking about rook c1 during the game, but after queen f8, I didn't like this idea of bishop h6. How do you respond to this? What should white play here? Well, from earlier in the game, we know that the move knight f2 is a very strong prophylactic idea, and it works again here. After bishop h6, which black shouldn't play, but just for illustrative purposes, we can take, play knight b5, and now because the rook and the d6 pawn are attacked, black must play rook c6, and after rook d1, d6 is hanging, queen a7 is coming, and black has no counterplay associated with queen e3 check. He doesn't get a single check in, and this is just excellent for white. So rook c1 would also be very good, but again, I had in mind that knight b2 would be the simplest way to play, just to avoid any tricks at all, and now the queen covers the bishop on e3, so there's no queen f8, bishop h6 ideas. Instead, my opponent played knight e8, and after rook c1, I'm just covering the c-pawn in advance. There are other ways to play, but this seemed the most solid, and black committed a big mistake with queen e6. It's a very difficult position already, so the move bishop b7 would have been black's best, but once again after knight b5 and say knight f2, white still has a commanding position with the ideas of putting pressure down the d-file and playing bishop h3, targeting the knight on d7. If black tries to get counterplay with the move f5, this runs into a refutation. Knight takes c6, rook takes. It makes sense to eliminate this bishop since the light squares are going to open up. E takes f5, g takes, b5 attacking the rook, and now queen a6. And you can see that the move f5 has definitely backfired on black and just created weaknesses. So going back, black played the move queen e6 in the game, and now it's time for white to calculate a way to continue. What should white do? Well, black's plan was to put pressure on the c4 pawn and also prevent white from playing bishop h3. He may be eventually preparing f5 as well. But in this situation, white can simply play knight takes c6, followed by queen a8. And once he calculates that taking on c4 is bad for black, then this is very good. So actually black just can't take on c4 at all here because the knight on e8 is hanging. So after rook takes c4, takes, and queen takes e8 check. One more precise move, such as bishop f1, will just kill everything for black. He has no counterplay here. So instead, he played the move rook c7. And now white has to decide how he's going to progress this position as well. How can he further improve? Well, one idea is just to play knight b2, with the idea of playing knight a4. This is a nice maneuver, putting pressure on the b6 pawn. But in the game, I picked the more straightforward b5, just clamping down the light squares. And I know that black can play knight c5, but that's the only good piece that he'll have, and white's knight also has rosy prospects on c6 or d5. So I wasn't too worried about knight c5. Bear in mind the knight also has to stay pinned to the b6 pawn, so that's not ideal for black either. After king f8 and bishop f1, I'm covering the c4 pawn indirectly, just in case. And if rook takes c4, I did calculate this during the game. Maybe it's overkill, but it's important to know how this works out for white. So have a think. What should white do? Well, after rook takes, queen takes, and knight c5, black is losing material here. And briefly I considered queen takes c5, bishop takes, d takes, thinking that, is there some way that black could possibly hold this? But actually after queen d8, this fortress of sorts just collapses, and black loses on the spot. So rook takes c4 is out of the question, and black instead uses the drawback to white's last move and plays knight c5 to try and secure this square for his knight. And here, black has potentially some counterplay. So how would you continue? Well, I didn't want to allow any tricks from black, so I just retreated and played queen a3, covering the b3 square. The computer is not afraid and wants to play knight b4, which is probably objectively the strongest move, but I didn't like the idea of knight b3. And for a human, it's not easy to judge that giving black this opportunity to put his knight on d4 actually gives no chances at all for black. For example, rook d1, and if knight d4, bishop takes, e takes. It's hard to evaluate this, or at least I found it difficult to evaluate this change of structure during the game, but in hindsight it's very clear that after knight d5, black is in dire straits. The transformation of the structure has favoured white. The knight on d5 is excellent, the pawn on b6 is weak, potentially d4 is weak as well, and black is quite tied up. Another option would have been rook takes c4 in this position, but after bishop takes, queen takes, and knight d5, this looks somewhat unclear with, for example, queen e2 coming from black, but after rook f1 and say knight c7, white can exchange on e8 whenever he wants and should be able to win that exchange up endgame. So this isn't very good for black. So knight b4 would have been the strongest move, and well done if you picked it, but I'm also quite happy with playing queen a3. I think preventing any knight b3 ideas is very human. After f5, black is finally getting in some counterplay. White can play bishop h3, and after knight f6, what would you play here for white? Well, the move I played actually is the strongest, knight b4. And white just keeps control over the position, doesn't allow black any counterplay. But there is also a forcing way to win material, so well done if you spotted this too. And again, it can tell you how you approach chess. It can give you a hint as to how you approach different positions. Because if you spotted the move, if you worked out the move knight takes c5, then maybe you tend to play more directly and are more adept at calculating forcing variations. After knight takes c5, d takes c5, I rejected the move queen d3 because I think from a distance I thought that black could simply take on e4, but actually queen d8 check is pretty bad for black with his queen and rook both hanging and no way to save both. No way to save either actually. But he can play rook d7, and after queen c2, now he can no longer defend the f5 pawn. So this is a forcing way to win material. Turns out here that it's not quite as strong as playing knight b4, but it is something that, if you did see this, it is an alternative way to win. After knight takes c5, d takes c5, I also spent a bit of time looking at ef, gf, and queen d3, but this didn't look as clear. After e4, queen d8 check, here black can play knight e8, defending the rook. And this gives black chances to resist. I have a longer line given in the notes there, but it basically ends up in this position, which isn't clearly winning for white. So certainly I stopped here in the game and thought, this is a bit messy. So as a result, I rejected queen d3, or I rejected knight takes c5, and went for knight b4 instead, which does keep control. And now this is a very difficult position for black, and the only move to defend or to prolong the game is to play king g8. But still, after knight c6, and for example bishop takes c5, trading off black's best piece, and queen d3, white is winning material here. After f takes e4, we have bishop takes e6 with check, so that's not an issue. And after queen d6, white can trade and take on f5 and just be a very big pawn up. So over time, white should definitely win this game. Instead, my opponent blundered again with knight fd7, and obviously he's under severe pressure here, so this is an understandable mistake to make. But now it's your turn to calculate a forced win. So have a think, what should white do? So no matter how positional your style, or how you perceive chess, how you think that you're a strategic player or positional type player, there always comes a time in a game where you have to calculate. And here there is a forced win available for white, and if he doesn't spot it, then there's a chance that black might create some more counterplay. So the move is queen a8 check. Now there are other winning moves, but this is definitely the most forcing and the strongest move. So in a way, this is a critical moment to try to find the best win for white. Queen a8 check is the way to do it. The point is that if queen e8, queen d5 is absolutely killing. It's dominating black. The f5 pawn is weak, the d6 pawn is weak, and tactically black's position just falls apart. Instead, king f7 is a better try, which is what played by my opponent in the game. And now white needs to find the key move, knight a6. And well done if you spotted this. The drama's not over though. There is a variation here that you need to calculate in advance in order to make sure this works tactically. After knight takes a6, b takes a6. Obviously, the a pawn on a6 is very dangerous for black. It's only 2 moves away from queening. But the question remains is what happens after rook takes c4. And here, before playing queen a8 check, it needed to be seen that rook takes, and queen d5 check just kills the game. Takes, and there's no way for black to stop the a pawn. So that was something that needed to be seen. Another thing that needed to be seen is how the game continued. After knight c5, black is trying to control the back rank by playing rook c8, a7, rook c8. How should I continue here? Well, the easiest way to win is the move queen b8. And this forced my opponent to resign. There's no way to stop a8 queen. If black tries queen e8, then the b6 pawn drops, and so there's probably d6 and maybe f5 as well, and black's position collapses. So this was a good start to the tournament for me as well. It was not a bad game to play, having not played for a long time. But the 3 things that we can learn from this game, or that I decided to say we should look at, are, first of all, when you have any sort of positional long-term advantage, your priority should be to keep control of the game and prevent any counterplay from the opponent. Instead, if you have a temporary advantage, such as a lead in development, then you need to strike and attack before your advantage dissipates. Another thing to think about is that it's always important to take into account your opponent's plans and ideas, whether you decide to prevent them or not. So there were moments during the game where we could have taken different approaches to solving the position and finding different moves, and there were equally good ways of doing it. But if you overlook your opponent's ideas, there's a chance that you might miss something very strong for them. Taking them into account doesn't mean that you prevent them, it just means that you keep them in mind while you're playing, and that's the best way to do it. And also, as I just mentioned, no matter how positional your style is, you also need to calculate and find forced wins when they're available. There were critical moments at different parts of the game. I've listed them in the notes, and we've gone through them as we talked about. Any position where I've put in the diagram or asked you to stop and think was a critical moment. It's clear that we were able to see what the critical moments were, and that you can see how much you can learn from just one game from studying it. Now, not all games end this way for me, and in the next chapter we're going to take a look at a loss and a draw, which are related in nature, and we'll see how much we can learn from those games too. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to analysing your games, and that you're all set to learn more about chess and prepare for your next tournament. See you in the next chapter.